Hi.
Good morning.
Explain the environment.
I'll move to the next question.
Bonjour, hello, hola, ni hao, howdy. Welcome to HEC Records. I'm Brad Harris. I'm thrilled to be with you. Thanks for taking this time out of your day to join us. I'm a professor of management and human resources at HEC Paris, where I work alongside some of the sharpest colleagues. I'm honored to represent that group in this business school. I'm also the co-founder of a group called People Leader Accelerator. And look, today we're going to talk about things like trust and teams, and this is something that I've been studying for the past 15 years of my life. Even before then, though, for as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated with great stories of teams, people that come together and achieve something special that exceeds the sum of their individual parts. I can remember watching Disney movies about this. I remember playing sports. To this day, I'm still fascinated by sports. In the US, we have a huge basketball tournament on right now, and you're seeing it play out all over the world. People can do great things when they come together as a team. Part of my work as a researcher and a scholar in this space is to not only study teams, but actually get in the field and work with teams. So this career has been awesome for me. I've been able to work with teams that are students creating these really awesome social impact projects that are going to change the world. And I've also been able to work with executive committee teams, people that are already in the C-suite running major organizations. I want to start with a few quotes that you've probably heard, things that you may have even seen on LinkedIn. The first one, teamwork makes the dream work. The second one, there is no I in team. Thirdly, together everyone achieves more. Raise your hand virtually if you've ever seen this. Yeah, I suspect these are pervasive. And one more. I have 3 children at home. Hello, kids. From the Lego movie. So I watch a lot of Disney and those types of movies, these children movies. And one of the ones that we have in our house is the Lego movie. Our kids love to play with Legos. And there's a song by Tegan and Sarah in that film, Everything is Awesome. And the quote out of there is, everything is awesome, everything is cool when you're part of the team. So certainly, in our society, in our culture, we have sort of this positive inclination, this positive affinity towards teamwork. But I want to perhaps take a step back and give you a quote that might be surprising, given that I'm here to pitch you on the virtue of teams. This is from the great scholar from Harvard, Richard Hackman. He said something along the lines of, I have no doubt that teams can generate magic, but don't count on it. I actually, after studying this for 15 years, I share Hackman's perspective here. I think we've used teams as a catch-all solution for our biggest, messiest problems, and then we seem surprised when they don't work out. There's a couple of issues I want to call out before we dive into the tips for how to get more out of your team. And the first one is, do we actually need a team? My colleague and good friend Brad Kirkman and I wrote a book, and it was published in 2017. And as part of the book and part of that research that went into it, we spent a lot of time and a lot of pages explaining the difference between groups and teams. And the big takeaway there is neither one of them is better than the other. Rather, it depends on your task. You really need something that justifies all the work that teams require. You need something that's big, messy, and complex if you really want to use teams. If not, a group will do. The second thing I want to call out is this idea that we don't want to put in all the legwork to make our teams truly great. And here's another phrase that I find useful. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And this implies that sometimes we have to go slow to go fast. And here there's one framework that I advise all leaders to kind of walk through before they decide they really need a team. And it's a simple cost-benefit framework. Anytime you use a team, anytime, there's always a tax. I call this the coordination tax. This is all the time, the energy, and the frustration that comes with even doing something as simple as finding a time for everyone to meet. But it also entails all of the work, emotional, psychological, physical, that goes through sorting out team conflicts. A lot of us, including here at HEC and beyond, are really trying and struggling with this issue of leveraging all of our diverse perspectives for tremendous outcomes. This implies there's some level of conflict, or at least misalignment. If you don't have the energy or the time to work through these issues, especially at the start of your team, you might want to rethink whether you need a team at all. Now, on the flip side, we have the team tax, the coordination tax. We also have the potential for synergies, or collaboration gains is what I call them. This is all the stuff I talked about before, all the movie stuff. This is, can we get something great that's more than the sum of our parts? So, bottom line, if you think you can get more from your synergies than you can pay for the tax of using teams, you're on the right path. If you have doubt, or you think there's a possible good enough solution with just using a simple group, go that direction. Save yourself a lot of pain. All right, now all this said, there's a tremendous opportunity for teams to really change the world here. And so I want to talk about that. And there's a really big spot for leaders here too. Now I'm going to talk about leaders as a single person, but I want to be really, really clear. Leaders don't have to have formal authority, and leaders don't have to be a single person. In fact, we see informal leadership and shared leadership all the time in teams. So bear with me and know that I'm only using teams as a single person just to make this a little bit simpler for the time that we have. One of the biggest charges that teams have, or team leaders have, is establishing a culture of trust within their collective unit. Let's go to the poll. Can we do that? Can I get a sign from the group when we get the poll up? Okay. We ask you before this event to rate, kind of your perception of your team's level of trust since the pandemic started in the past few years. The results really match a lot of other data sources. If you look closely at this, there's a couple different ways you could interpret it. But by and large, the minority of people say that trust has actually improved since the pandemic. Most of us have said it's either stayed the same or gotten worse. And I'm really going to target this almost 4 in 10 people that said trust has decreased in the past few years, because I think we can spend some time here and maybe we can develop some strategies that help us improve that situation. So why is trust important? Let me read off a few stats from the Gallup organization that I think are pretty compelling and make the why case very, very clear. Okay, so Gallup organization, one of the leading scientific firms that kind of monitors employee opinions, attitudes, beliefs. They say 96% of engaged employees trust their management. Highly trusted workplaces are 50% more productive. They devote 106% more energy to their tasks, and they have 13% fewer sick days. There's also, at the firm level, major differences between high trust and low trust organizations. So trust is clearly something that we need to be thinking about. It's not easily won, though. It takes a lot of effort. So as leaders, what are some things that we can do today to help build trust in our organization? First, focus on your social exchanges. Think as simple as the norm of reciprocity here. People will trust others that trust them. I think here it also makes sense for us to take a step back and think critically and define our terms. What is trust? When I teach this to my MBAs, or when I'm working with executive committees, or when I'm doing executive coaching, I describe trust as simply as our willingness to be vulnerable to another person. So in the context of social exchanges, we need to show that we're vulnerable to other people if we want them to reciprocate that. And then we also need to role model this so others can see how they might interact with their other teammates. Very much related to this, what goes into trust? I like to use a framework and I'm building here from the work of Francis Fry at Harvard, the trust triangle. People trust one another when they feel like they're interacting with the real person, so authenticity. They trust one another when they feel like they can trust the judgment and the decision-making of another person. This is logic. And they trust people when they feel like the other person cares about them, empathy. And so when I diagnose trust breakdowns, when we have this absence of trust in teams, it can almost always be traced to a breakdown in one of those three pillars of authenticity, logic, and empathy. So trust is without question a bedrock to teams. It gets the static out of the way. It's the glue that keeps us together. And it moves us from simple coordination towards cooperation, and even better than that, towards true collaboration. So what else can we do as leaders? This is an interesting question. There's lots of different leader behaviors. We can't cover them all here, but I think they can be delineated onto two broad categories here. The first being team design, and the second being team coaching. Now, when I teach this, whether it's to an executive audience or an undergraduate audience or something in between, I'd always start with this question of, what do you think is most important for team leadership? Design or coaching behaviors? And without fail, people tend to side with the coaching. And why do they do that? Well, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. I think a lot of us hear design and we think, this is too HR focused. This is things I can't control. I can't pick the people on my team. I can't change their pay structure. So I want to go where I have the most agency coaching. Fair enough. But that's selling short, I think, all of the design features that we can actually have influence in our day-to-day roles as leaders. So for instance, setting a compelling vision, crafting goals that make sense, giving feedback about role clarity, all of these things are design issues that we can work on, that we can emphasize every single day as leaders. Let's use a real-life example to talk about team design and why this is important and not just some HR issue. In addition to loving sports when I was growing up as a kid, I was also fascinated by space and space exploration. I grew up in Texas. We have a big space center in Houston, Texas, where NASA has coordinated missions. They actually take off from Florida, but we've coordinated big missions, a big source of state and national pride. And so I've always liked these things. And now NASA and many other space agencies are working on an even bigger mission than just landing on the moon. They want to send people to Mars. And then who knows what happens when we get there. So here I want to draw from some of the work of a colleague in my field, a super sharp professor named Suzanne Bell at DePaul University, who's working on a grant with NASA to kind of figure out what a team might look like to go to Mars. So this is truly future of work stuff, not just buzzwords or speculation. This is happening right now. It's a very real issue. And let's set the stage here. If you want to send people to Mars, here's your constraints. You can only take about 4 to 5 people. So from a design perspective, you need people that know what they're doing. You need people to have clear roles because no one can know everything. But you also need them to have some degree of overlap so that in case something happens. Likewise, we're not talking Millennium Falcon, Death Star, or even these ships from Star Trek here. We're talking a ship about the size of a Winnebago. These are the things that you take your small family camping on. So a Winnebago-sized structure, and you got to be there a long time. 2.5 years, give or take, to go to Mars. So you have to have people that not only know what they're doing, but people that can stand other people and won't go crazy. So design, this is a real issue. It's super important. Okay, if we look past design and we go towards coaching, this is where we also have an opportunity to exercise some agency. Actually, let me step back and add one more thing about the design versus coaching trade-off. They are not mutually exclusive. You can do both, and both are important. I want to call out some research by Ruth Wagaman and again Richard Hackman. Wagaman in her studies found something really, really interesting. And that's that sometimes when you have a good team design, you've got the right people, the right goals, things like this, the right incentives, role clarity, that can cover for mediocre leaders and mediocre coaching. However, great coaching behaviors seldom can overcome a bad design. So design really is where we should invest some legwork up front. Okay, now let's move to coaching. This is the exciting stuff that everybody wants to hear. Leaders are so instrumental in creating an environment of trust, psychological safety, and empowerment, and these are all ingredients we need to be adaptable. So if we're talking about how uncertain the world is today, and we know we're going to have to adapt and improvise and be agile and all of these things, we absolutely need those states of trust, psychological safety, and empowerment. How do we do that? Here's what I encourage you as leaders. First, above all else, your job is to drive clarity. There's a wonderful quote by Bob Johansen that goes something like this: "The future will reward clarity, but punish certainty." I love this. It's freeing. It's a little ambiguous, granted, but it's freeing. We don't have to know all of the answers as leaders. All we have to do is keep our team focused on the main goal. I have a colleague, a business partner, a very good friend named Andrew Bartlow. I love it. Every time he works with leaders, his main point is almost always ruthless prioritization. Or, in other words, it's easier to move 3 things a mile than 30 things an inch. Boy, if we could remind ourselves of that, and we could be mindful to say no as much as we say yes, we would all probably be better, more focused leaders. Another way to think about driving clarity is your job is to help people find their mountain and stay focused on their mountain. Said differently, we want to say, this is the mountain we'll climb. Not this one, not that one. This is the mountain we'll climb. Now, how we climb it is up for negotiation, but choice of mountain is not. The second behavior, so first was driving clarity. Second, share strategic information. It's fascinating. Brad Kirkman and I, when we were writing our book, we came across so many leaders that just thought, for whatever reason, they didn't need to share high-level strategic information with their teams. Some of these were well-intentioned leaders that didn't want to distract their teams with stuff that was outside of their control. I like the intention. Other times it felt like leaders were preserving this information because that was their source of power. This is what gave them something scarce that allowed them to remain important. Don't love that motive. Whatever the intention, though, we have to share strategic information if we want our teams to work together and work with intention rather than just following standard operating procedures. Number 3, create, enforce, preserve a regular check-in and communication process. Here you need to be doing this with individuals on your teams as well as the team as a whole. Communication and having a regular pattern of communication is so vital for team success. And research also tells us, importantly, for complex issues where we really need people to work together, the richer the communication, the better. So if you can get in a room and talk in person, wonderful. If you can't, rely on richer modes like Zoom, Teams, whatever. But be really careful about canceling meetings and allowing people to use an email as an excuse to communicate important information. There's too much that gets lost in translation with email, and it really costs us. And sometimes you don't know it costs you until further down the road. Number 4, make learning a priority. Okay, so when I talk with teams, we spend a lot of time building out what an after-action review or a debrief might look like. And I got to give it to all the leaders I work with. They're smart about this. They know these things. But we are really good about debriefing ourselves and our teams when things go wrong. This is where we learn a lot. This is where we learn the most. What we're not good at is learning from our successes. We make these fundamental attribution errors where we think we were successful because we were great. We don't acknowledge that sometimes external factors might have broke our way, and frankly, that we just got a little bit lucky. What ends up happening then when we fall into these fundamental attribution errors and we don't fully debrief our successes is we don't notice when our environment changes and we keep doing the same things, and then only when it's too late do we realize we should have pivoted, we should have been more adaptable, we should have improvised. The last thing, we need to role model and enforce the values that we want our team to live by. This means, like we talked about earlier, being vulnerable to others, being kind to others, showing our teams what an appropriate interaction might look like. Teams are remarkable in the sense that they can come together and they develop norms quickly, often in the first 5 minutes. And think about this, they don't always form the right norms or healthy norms. You can probably imagine multiple scenarios where you came together as a team and the person that was loudest or the person that talked the most or the person that was most passionate about their ideas became the de facto leader because other people didn't know how to get their voice into the equation, or they thought, this isn't worth it. If they want to do it, let them go. It would be much better if we had processes where the smartest person or the most knowledgeable person on a particular subject took the lead. And these can rotate over our performance episodes. But anyway, our job as leaders is to make sure we're developing the right norms. Likewise, going back to trust, teams have this remarkable capacity when they first start to look like they really do trust each other. We assume everyone's on the same page. This is a phenomenon we call swift trust. The problem with swift trust is although it looks real, it's often incredibly fragile and falls apart at the first instance of tension. My advice is even when you have the appearance of swift trust and functional norms, is make sure you're doing an audit and make sure you're helping people and make sure you're showing people what it looks like to be a good team member. Speak up, be kind, enforce clarity, and use social recognition to your advantage. Call out publicly and privately when people do things that show them how you live out these values in an exceptional way. Look, that's my 5 tips. Drive clarity, share strategic information, create regular communication and check-in processes, make learning a priority, and role model the values you want to see. I'll end with this before we take questions. Leadership is a grand challenge, and it's even grander in teams. But it's one worth taking on. Leaders can come from all walks of life. They can look like anything. They can have any background. But with these 5 behaviors, along with your own smarts and your own critical thinking, you really can do big, amazing things with teams. What do you say we take some questions?
Well, our thanks, Professor Harris, for that very insightful presentation. I was just wondering about a few questions of my own, first of all, before the public that's been joining us from around the world. You've written and taught quite a lot about scale-ups and the challenges that go along with growth. What do you believe in terms of the people's priorities should be in a high-growth organization?
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts here. Thank you for asking that one, Daniel. So this is definitely a place where teams make sense. We're dealing with lots of uncertainty, both in the external environment, but internal as well. The big challenge, I think, is staying focused on what matters. When we're faced with uncertainty, which is pervasive in scale-ups and startups in these environments, we tend to frame things in the negative. Occasionally we have these outliers that frame everything in the positive, but most of us, when we face uncertainty, frame things in the negative, and we're biased towards action. We will work on anything to have some sense of control, even if that's not the right thing we need to be working on. So it's really about ruthless prioritization. I will add a couple of things about the scale-up context, and this comes through time and time again in my work with the People Leader Accelerator, but also in my MBA classes at HEC Paris. And that's this idea that organizations, when they grow, go through these periods of evolution where we just kind of get better, we refine our processes, things like this, and then we have these landmark moments of revolution. So evolution and revolution. Those revolution moments are really the make or break, live or die moments for organizations and the teams within them. They're tricky though, because we don't always see them coming. Things break rapidly, and it's really a challenge for leaders to help people clarify how they add value, but also our roles change in those moments, and we have to be ready for those. So that's kind of my 2 cents about scale-ups. Excellent question.
Evolution towards revolution in the context of what we're living in France, it's all the more salient, I believe.
Yeah, if people want to know more about this framework, this is from Larry Greiner, and this was originally, I think it might be the second or third most cited article or downloaded article ever on Harvard Business Review. It was originally published in the 70s, and then it got republished in the 90s, and then we're still using it today. So it's interesting. We are living in super complex times, incredibly, overwhelmingly complex times. But one thing I find fascinating is that every generation that's ever walked this earth has been convinced they live in the most complex times. So while these things can both be true, we really have a lot of work. A lot of smart people have invested in studying these problems that we can learn from.
And one of these complexities has been visited by the pandemic, the health pandemic of the last few years. And last year you published an article I read on the impact of COVID-19 and what it could have in terms of on workers and their pro-social behaviors, so their values and their response to mistreatment. You focused on the Chinese American community, especially in the United States. Remind the viewers of your conclusions and how that's linked perhaps to trust.
Yeah, I'll do my best. So this work was a direct offshoot of the pandemic. We knew the world was changing. We were impacted personally, but we could see it in our stakeholders, our students, our clients, things like this. We were studying values, like big societal, like these long, generally stable values that motivate people. And this was important to us. My team is also team scholars, but this is important because how you lead teams across different cultures matters. And so we need to understand this. Now, research tells us that values do change, but it's kind of like icebergs. They generally change pretty slow. The one exception, and this goes not just for big societal values, but also for our personality, our inner motives, is when we go through really big traumatic events. So in the personality space, personality traits are generally stable, but they can change. 3, sometimes 4 Ds is what we use, and it's death, drugs, disability, things like this. If we're impacted by something that strong, we might actually change fundamental parts of what drive us. And we have preliminary evidence. It'll be interesting to see how sticky our data are, but we have preliminary evidence that suggests all of the madness of the pandemic, interestingly, and perhaps this is a silver lining on the whole deal, pushed people to be more pro-social. We were willing to come together. And whether we're talking about China, which is where we studied this, or in Europe here or my home country of the United States, that's sort of a refreshing change. It felt like we've been becoming more individualistic. There's fault lines, politics, whatever, that keep us from coming together. So if people have more pro-social motives, they're more willing to trust one another and they're more open to teamwork. So time will tell, the jury is still out, but we have early indications that the pandemic, probably not surprisingly, did change us, but maybe even in some good ways.
Brad, I have so many questions, but they're starting to come in thick and fast. And I'd like to quote you one from Rahil, who is writing in from Tunisia. And he says, I think it is hard to convince some team members to adhere to a certain vision. Do you have any practical advice?
Yeah, so the vision. So Rahil is smart. Like, this is a known challenge. How do we get people to buy into some sort of collective vision? One of the things is we have to create a sense of urgency or importance around our vision. So this doesn't solve everything, but people are really motivated to make changes, to shift their views, or even buy into the collective good when they sense there's a sense of urgency. If we don't do anything, all of this can fall apart. Interestingly, along those same lines, people are a lot more motivated to avoid losses than pursue gains. So this is not just about telling people all we have to gain from following this collective vision. It's about articulating our purpose in terms of losses as well. Last thing, we should always think about the WIFM. That's what's in it for me. So if you can remember the WIFM and you can actively work to get people to show people how it benefits them as an individual, you've got a better shot. Excellent question, though.
WIFM, I love that abbreviation. A question from Arman in Iran, it rhymes. What's your opinion about critical thinking in leadership? Short and sharp.
Yeah, wonderful question. I'm all for it. I tell everybody that I work with, the answer when we deal with humans is almost always it depends. And that is for sure the case with teams. Critical thinking is the currency that separates good leaders from great leaders, in my opinion.
Eric in Ghana, I'll move on to him. He says, slightly longer, how do you redesign a team which has already been set up without frustrating members of the team, especially in a situation where you're assigned the responsibility of managing an existing team? So it's a question of egos, perhaps.
The question of egos, we have patterns that a lot of people think work. In Brad and I's book, 3D Team Leadership, we talked a lot about people aren't just on one team, they're on multiple teams. So it really is a big lift to redesign a team. A lot of us also don't have the power to switch out team members, and certainly this is a sensitive issue. But you can have success with interventions. When you have these interventions and you want to explain why or how you're going to do things different, it's important to remember sort of the golden circle here. And here I'm going to borrow from Simon Sinek. We need to start with why. We need to create a compelling rationale for why we need to redesign teams. We need evidence for why it's not working. If we can nail the why, then we can extend outward to how and what. So start with the why and be as clear as possible about the rationale.
Moving on to Noria Shaou, I'm not too sure where she's writing in, but she asks, how do you retain employees' motivation and investment when tomorrow is another day and nothing remains for sure? That kind of uncertainty reality.
Oh, yeah, so the uncertainty question, and this is certainly something that I've been dealing with some of our leaders that are in the scale-up space. We had venture capital, everything was rich, and only in the past 12 months, assuming we survived the pandemic as a business, the money has dried up. Now we're worried about layoffs. Even if our company is safe, we're seeing large companies laying off tens of thousands of people almost weekly, it seems like. So how do you, part of it is crafting a message. And one thing that I really, really appreciate about helping people change their mindsets is this idea that we need to over-communicate by a factor of 10. So anytime you as a leader feel like you're sick of hearing yourself say the same thing, you're probably almost saying it enough for people to remember it. Another thing, and this goes back to sort of that trust triangle of being authentic, being empathetic, and showing logic, we have to live those every single day. People may not be able to trust the broader environment, but we can take a lot of solace and we can be quite functional if we can trust our internal environment. And that's where leaders and our teammates actually have an advantage over just simple group work.
You talked about drying up metaphorically, but here's a question that comes from Isma Belkacem, who is currently watching from the desert in a boot camp with a team of leaders.
Nice.
And he asks, don't you think that a spiritual vision could help leaders to have support for leading their teams?
Absolutely. And so, well, the answer is it depends here. But we need people that share sort of our spiritual values to do this. But relying on spiritual influences is actually like a well-documented and empirically sound way to connect to people and give them a sense of meaning. One thing that we talk a lot about at HEC, in my department, but also broadly as a school, is this idea of having meaning or purpose in our work. And so let me just validate that in a lot of contexts, if you can make that spiritual connection, if you can draw toward a higher purpose, that is absolutely motivating to people.
So I hope that's some spiritual water for you, Isma. Coming back to France, Ravel Lawson is watching from Lyon, one of my favorite cities in France, and he asks, what would you say is the biggest challenge in leading an international environment with different profiles and cultural backgrounds?
Yeah, you have to do a lot of legwork on global teams. And this is an important question because this is actually the type of diversity where we have there's the potential there to do really, really big things, these cross-natural global teams. This may not be the deepest answer, but one of the biggest challenges is finding a regular communication pattern. Getting people in the same room, whether it's virtual or not, is incredibly difficult when you've got people working all over the world. If you have people that are located in different locations, I suggest keeping a regular meeting schedule, but rotating the specific time of day so that not everyone has to take a meeting at 2 a.m. Sometimes the leader takes the meeting at 2 a.m. and so on. Let people share the burden there. More broadly speaking, you can have a global team that's co-located or at least in the same space. You really have to be mindful of cultural differences here. Mm-hmm. And so I work a lot with co-authors, really smart people in Asia, and we make assumptions that we're the same, we work together well, but it wasn't always that way. Like, we have fundamental differences in power distance and individualism and collectivism. People don't adhere neatly always to broad cultural values of societies, but that is, when we look at things like Hofstede's factors of global dimensions, they are sort of a useful starting point for thinking about how we might want to behave differently. The social contact hypothesis is the answer here, though. We really need to invest time for people to get to know one another. When we see that other people are just like us, they're humans trying to just get by, we're willing to learn and overlook a lot of these nuances that can be offensive in isolation. So take the time, do the legwork, but yeah, cultural values are real.
Yeah, cultural, and then we also have, I imagine, generational differences, these new generations who have new values because of maybe globalization that has made them evolve in terms of the world they live in.
Yeah, Tom Friedman wrote a book called The World is Flat, or something like this, a couple decades ago. And his hypothesis has been somewhat proven out. Cultural values are coming together, but the world is not completely flat. And you're right. It's not just nationalities, and it's age, it's other demographics, it's socioeconomic status, it's gender and sex, it's all of these issues.
Laura, I invite her to look again at perhaps the masterclass you gave us, because she asked what key features a leader should have, but perhaps you want to add or a couple, because you gave plenty, I think, of the features.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. What makes a good leader? I'm a firm believer that leadership can be taught. We can learn these things. You need to be a critical thinker. You need to be flexible, and you need to be someone that has really got the chops. You need to have just enough competence. You don't have to be an expert, but just enough competence to keep people's eye on the ball. And that goes back to our visioning, our prioritization issue. Can we keep people focused on the right things?
We have, I think, time for just a few more questions. Patrick van der Woen from Utrecht, my apologies for the accents, in the Netherlands, asks, besides the rationale, what are 3 short-term effects for both the team as well as their direct stakeholders? So it affects anybody that can observe. I'm not too clear about the conclusion of that question.
Takeaways regarding what? Can you repeat this?
Besides the rationale, what are 3 short-term effects for both the team as well as their direct shareholders, effects that anybody can observe?
Okay, I'm not sure I'm tracking the question. I think there's something really, really useful here in Patrick's question. The three effects of teams and their stakeholders. We've written a lot about teams. We can't just think of them as one thing in the collective product. We have to think about them as a collection of individuals in a broader network. So teams are affecting the individuals within the team. They're affecting other teams in the organization, and they're affecting other stakeholders in the organization, other leaders, other teams, and of course our external stakeholders. So if Patrick wants to follow up with me, just shoot me a LinkedIn message, Patrick. I'm sure I'm missing something vital there, but good question.
Okay. Well, Brad, my thanks to you for this fascinating exchange on trust and leadership. Unfortunately, time is our enemy, and we're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you again, and thank all of you for tuning in for the last better part of an hour. Should you want to further explore the work by Brad Harris, I'd really like to invite you to read some of his publications, both in major journals that have published his work in the past decade, as well as his 2 books, including 3D Team Leadership, which came out in 2017. I think you referred to it earlier. This is a publication that focuses on people's priorities and on a new approach for complex teams, which very much sums up, I think, today's subject. You can find all these references on our LinkedIn page as well as YouTube, which is devoted to this masterclass. My thanks to the HEC team in the production of this masterclass, and tune in again to the next one, which is scheduled for May 25th. Thank you and goodbye. Goodbye.
Hi.
Good morning.
Explain the environment.
I'll move to the next question.